The story I'm about to tell is personal. It is the story of a secret that until today I have kept hidden. The events unfolded in Jerusalem, where a business trip took me for a couple of weeks. I stayed in a hotel in the city center. I still remember the touch of the pink limestone on its walls, its Assyrian and Phoenician inspiration, and its rectangular presence. The reasons that took me to the Holy Land are not relevant. The remarkable things happened in my free time, specifically during my morning walks. It didn't take long for me to establish a little routine, and I spent the mornings visiting the old city. I crossed the Jaffa Gate and headed for the intricate alleys of its markets, Muristan and Aftimos. There, I was surrounded by fabrics and carpets of impossible colors that hung from unseen places. I came across early rising tourists and occasionally discovered a fountain of Ottoman origin. It was a beautiful and cozy labyrinth. Although I usually boast about having a good sense of direction, I have to admit, more than once I was lost in that geometry. Wanting to differentiate myself from the insubstantial tourist, I looked for less crowded alleys. In one of them, I found a narrow bookstore. Its owner was an old man named Arif. He told me that, as a young man, he had been quiet and lazy, and that age had made him talkative and energetic. We soon became friends, and I went to visit him every day. He would make me coffee, and we would chat in comical, broken English. On my 8th or 9th visit, Arif was tense, though not lacking in his usual cheerfulness. He interrupted our conversation to confess that he had something to show me. He invited me into the back room, and there he searched among piles of books, boxes, and furniture. He returned with an ancient tome and placed it on a small table for me to examine. The cover and the spine were completely worn, and neither the title nor the author could be read. I thought I guessed some Roman letters, a G and an A specifically. I know that many won't believe what I'm going to say now. Everyone is free to think whatever they want. I opened the book in the middle. The 2 yellow pages describe some fantastic civilization. They look like excerpts from a travel book. Arif urged me to turn the page. I obeyed and was surprised. The next couple of pages were made of a strange plastic. Its touch was a new sensation. I went back to the previous page, but the yellow pages were now high-quality paper, and the text spoke of other cultures. Obviously, I thought I had turned 2 pages at once and stubbornly tried to separate the paper with my thumb. Arif's laugh made me abandon this. I tried to go back to the plastic page, but it had turned into ancient paper, and a piece fell apart in my hand. My old friend explained to me that the pages of the book are never repeated. They disappear when you turn them and are replaced by others of different materials and texts. The only thing they have in common is their descriptions of fantastic cultures and worlds and the adventures of the author. Short stories and poems could also be found. The style suggested that they were written by the same person, whom Arif called the Traveler. He said that he had never seen the same page, neither he nor the man who had sold him the book. I decided not to ask about the seller. After this experience, I wanted to go back to the hotel. Arif then became determined to sell me the book. He tried to convince me by saying that he felt that the book was looking for its author and that for some reason he thought that it could be me. I didn't think his words made any sense, but it was undeniable that I was very curious about the book. I wanted to study it in detail and discover the trick. I promised to come back the next day with a decision. The truth is that I was carrying little money, and it seemed fair to offer him a reasonable amount for such a special object. When Arif heard my plan, he looked sad, but after a few seconds, he seemed to remember something and showed his young smile again. That day, my work took me to Tel Aviv, where I spent the night. I returned to Jerusalem early in the morning, and not wanting to miss my daily appointment with Arif, I went directly to the old city without stopping by the hotel. I had an unpleasant surprise. The small bookstore had been replaced by an ordinary souvenir shop that had not yet opened. I was shocked by such a sudden change. I thought it was impossible to make such a business change in just one day. I stupidly put it down to it being a tourist area and Israeli efficiency. I felt sad because I had no way of contacting Arif. Nearby vendors told me they didn't see him often. I decided to return the next day to look for information about my old friend. I can tell you in advance that I couldn't find anything. I walked back to the hotel. I entered my room, and waiting on the desk was Arif's book. After the initial shock, I called the front desk and asked if anyone had left anything for me. They told me they hadn't. Perhaps they heard a hint of concern in my voice because they also checked the security cameras to make sure no one had broken into my room. But I wasn't worried. I took it as a farewell gift from Arif. Since then, I have been taking notes from the book, transcribing entire texts so that nothing is lost when I turn a page. Hopefully, one day I can tell someone the hidden stories in this book. Maybe I'll illustrate them too. Leandro Laya was a wealthy man, and every day he would search through the garbage of the neighborhood. He used to come back home carrying rusty metals, leftover food, malodorous plastics, and all kinds of trinkets. He accumulated everything in the basement, and there he spent a major part of his time. He asked both his wife and daughters to never enter the room, at least while he was alive. It was a surprising and a somewhat disturbing request, but the family accepted and kept the promise. The neighbors couldn't understand his obsession for garbage, but rejected the idea that he had become insane. Leandro had always had a touch of genius that excused such eccentricities, and in his dealings with society, he had always been polite and charming. When asked about the garbage, he would answer with humor and apologize for the bad impression he might have caused. From his explanations, it was possible to infer that his accumulation of waste had a purpose, one which he always denied. At first, Leandro's wife worried about her husband's mental health. After some conversations about it, she was relieved to see that it was nothing more than an eccentric fixation. When she asked him why he was doing it, he didn't answer. She correctly understood that his silence didn't come from the desire to hide a secret, but from the fear of revealing something too intimate, so much so that not even he could comprehend it. He knew that his intentions were good. He also knew that his behavior could have negative repercussions for his family, and he would change it if necessary. These concerns turned out to be unfounded. With the exception of an occasional joke, the image that the town had of Leandro was more than positive. It could even be said that the situation helped to create the image of a mad genius, which made him more attractive. Some neighbors report seeing multicolored lights coming out of the basement windows. The lack of something new made Leandro's strange routine lose its interest over time, and Leandro and his hobbies became part of the town's normality. After a reasonable number of years, Leandro Laya died. The gathering of garbage continued until his very last days. Freed from the promise made in her childhood, one of his daughters went down to the basement. She expected an ocean of cables, plastics, and rotten food. She found none of that. The floor and the walls were perfectly clean, and in the middle of the basement there was a floating sphere, as mechanical as it was organic. It radiated a calm light that contained a woman's gasp of surprise. For several minutes, she stood motionless, trying to understand the sphere. She called her sisters. All of them felt the need to show the town the miracle. The neighbors lined up, and one by one came in to see the strange object. Some refused to leave the basement and religiously gave themselves over to the silver ball. None dared to touch it. Comments and questions began to spread. Was this Leandro's objective? How could something sacred be created from garbage? There were those who claimed to have seen the mechanical components of the sphere dissolve in the ball like mercury and reappear at another point. There were also those who swore they had heard it breathe, and those who said they had seen a face in it. A neighbor thought he recognized his old radio. Having contributed to the sphere filled him with joy. Another wondered if the miracle was not a manifestation of Leandro's soul. This unusual idea interested many, and they confessed to having finally understood the gathering obsession of the deceased. At nightfall, the neighbors were still waiting patiently. It was then that the sphere began to stir. A silver tongue violently sprung out of it, pierced through the basement window, and reached the road without hurting anyone. For a moment, it was motionless but throbbing. From the tip of the tongue sprouted strange fingers, which soon multiplied. They spread through the air and onto the ground with the color of gasoline on asphalt, forming multicolored tentacles, holographic wires, translucent eyes, metal bars covered in reflections, fluorescent mouths and teeth, beams of light. The huge threads enveloped the sky and the buildings, always avoiding people and animals with gentleness. Wherever they landed, life arose. They revitalized the trees they touched and purified the air from pestilence and pollution. In just a few hours, the planet was covered with this divine fungus. This was the day Leandro Laya achieved his goal, the day in which what we now know as paradise was created. The book in my hand had a great influence on me, and yet almost nothing is known about the author. I resolved to fix this mistake. His name was Othman de Mirel, and he was born at the beginning of the 20th century in a small village on the Black Sea near the city of Trabzon. There he lived and died. It can be understood through his writings that he was mute. He was never an important figure in the world of literature, not even locally. He published only 3 books, 2 of which are impossible to find. I have a copy of the third, the only one that achieved minimal recognition. It was a gift from my grandmother. In part, this explains the affection I have for the book. It is titled Thela and the Foundations of the World, and tells the life of a hero whose adventures reflect the highest dilemmas of philosophy. The truth is that the style that he adopts in this work makes it dense and impenetrable. I doubt that even the most enlightened academic can understand it. I confess that I am unaware of the reason why this work influenced me so much. But in that tangle of indecipherable sentences, I thought I was approaching the truth, like someone who contemplates an abstract painting and derives meaning from it. Perhaps it was his mysterious choice of words. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. I was born in Izmir, and in 1992 I got my degree in Turkish literature from Istanbul University. It was the following year, during my vacation, that I began my research on Othman de Mirel. It wasn't easy to get new information. I traveled to Trabzon, and after going through archives and libraries for hours, I was lucky enough to find a collection of essays by local authors. One of them, whose last name was Atis, mentions de Mirel and poetically describes him as a magical man who does not produce any sounds, pure silence. This confirmed the idea that he was mute. As I was about to leave, the librarian approached me. My arduous search made him curious, and he asked me about it. My answer surprised him. He told me that his father had worked in that same library and had heard from him an impossible story about Othman de Mirel. According to his father, de Mirel was not mute. He simply lived in a world without sound. Neither his voice, nor his footsteps, nor his hand claps could be heard. We took it for a magic trick. Suddenly, the description from the essay seemed less poetic. I finally arrived at the small town where Demirel had lived. I was hoping that the elders would remember him, and I intended to interview them. I was the only guest in the only hostel. The conversation with the librarian had made my research more fun, but I didn't want to include supernatural opinions or cheap superstitions in my work. Unfortunately for me, each and every one of the elders I interviewed corroborated the words of the librarian. One of them, named Aisel, even gave me the keys to Demirel's house, still standing but abandoned. She lived in the house next door, and she confessed that in her youth she had read many of his writings, most of which were never published. The fact that I was interested in such a forgotten writer moved her, and she offered to help me in any way she could. From my conversations with the elders, I learned that Demirel had lived there with his wife, and that he was not a very sociable person. I guess he was aware of his supernatural condition, but otherwise, they were a pleasant couple. Demirel could hear his wife, but he had to tell her everything in writing. He also seemed to talk to himself a lot, although no one knew about what. He and his wife died relatively young and childless. I went into the house the next morning, but found nothing of interest. I paid a visit to Aisel, who offered me something to eat. I told her that I had already had breakfast, but my strength weakened at the old woman's insistence. While I ate, she told me about Demirel. Every day at 6 in the morning, he went out for a walk in the park, very punctual and lonely. He dedicated the afternoon to writing, and occasionally he explored the town and gave poems and stories to the neighbors. She told me that one morning she saw him in the park, and he seemed to be in ecstasy, dancing and singing like a bird. As soon as he got home, he sat down to write and didn't stop for 4 days. The result was the law and the foundations of the world. Aisel knew many details about Demirel thanks to his wife. The two were friends despite the difference in age. I learned that Demirel had not always been like that. He had had a normal childhood until one day, sound decided to abandon him. Little by little, his voice died away, and the silence extended to what he touched. Neither the doors he closed nor the keys he dropped were audible. I went back to the house and carefully closed the door. I stopped in the middle, regretting that I had no chance of solving the enigma. The minutes that followed were one filled with panic and paralysis. I heard a door close behind me and footsteps approaching, but there was no one there. I heard the footsteps go to the table in front of me, and I heard the chair being dragged. I knew the voice I was hearing was Demirel's, talking to himself. He talked about the pleasant walk and hoped that perhaps today his talent would allow him to write a few lines. He had a conversation with his wife. I knew because he read everything he was writing to her. At one point I calmed down. I tried to talk to that invisible ghost, but there was no answer. I put it down to a hallucination, even though I knew that what I was experiencing was real. I took the tape recorder with which I had interviewed the elders and placed it on the table. In the evening, I returned to the hostel, exhausted and confused. I had spent a day with Othan Demirel. I just stopped to buy batteries at the town store. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I was back in front of the house, and just as I had anticipated, Demirel's spirit punctually opened the door and headed for the park. At first, it was difficult for me to follow the soft steps of the invisible figure, but soon he began to speak, and I was able to easily accompany him. My theory was as stupid as it was impossible. What I was hearing were the sounds that Demirel had produced in his time, sounds that appeared in the world about 60 years later. I worried about having such intimate access to his life. Assuming that all that craziness was true, I ignored the supernatural aspects of the situation and set out to get as much information as I could about the writer. For several days, I recorded Mirel's entire life. Unfortunately, he seemed to be going through a creative block and was unable to write anything decent. I thought that perhaps these events should be studied by someone more competent than me, but I didn't want to be taken for a madman, and at the time, I didn't trust my sanity either. Finally, there were surprises. I got home at 6 in the morning, as always, but the Mirel didn't show up. I entered the house, and everything was silent. On the way to the park, I heard screaming. It was the Mirel, singing, completely elated and radiant. I remember Isel's words. The day the Mirel sang in the park was the same day he started writing his masterpiece. So it was. He ran home and I followed him and got the tape recorder ready. Those were 4 days of magic in which I was able to admire the creative genius of the artist. Oh, how I appreciate his habit of talking to himself. The book, which had seemed to me as inspiring as it was incomprehensible, became simple, and its secrets became transparent and definite truths. The Mirel had touched the foundations of the world and spoken of how liberating these ideas were and how dangerous they could be. The fear of spreading such a powerful view of the world made him decide, on the second day, to hide the simplicity of his discovery. He tangled the text with impossible metaphors and the most complex of grammars, a kind of filter so that the power of truth would not fall into the wrong hands. Having recorded everything, I decided to return to the hostel. For a moment, I thought that spending so much time in that house would make me part of that hallucination. From the threshold of the door, I contemplated the town in silence. I took a step and panic seized me. My foot had made no sound, or was it my imagination? To make sure, I took one more step. The dream that I'm going to describe was dreamed in 1912. I would like to know how many of the details that I'm going to relate actually happened that night in that head centuries ago. I am convinced that many embellished the story. I promise to honestly tell everything I know. The dream begins in a realm of gods, a heavenly landscape reminiscent of Olympus. I have to say that these gods do not correspond to any from our reality. They seem to be nothing more than tricks of the imagination. One of them talks to himself, sitting on a beautiful granite bench surrounded by columns. Since his name is unknown, I will make use of the Hellenic aesthetic and call him Hermes. His monologue highlights divine tedium, the lack of adventure and excitement that comes with immortality. He says he is aware that some of his companions like to forget their status as gods and descend into the world of mortals. They enjoy and suffer the life of man, and when they die, their souls return to the heavens, and with them, their memories. They recount their exploits and torments, and boast about their bravery for choosing to forget that they are gods. But to Hermes, this is cowardice. The true risk is in the possibility of losing one's god nature while being aware of it. Hermes wants to show them the purest courage and decides to risk everything. He goes to his companions and explains the plan. He will go down to the world and be immortal. He will retain his memory, and only if he convinces men that he is a god will he regain his divinity. One of them, let's call him Ares, tries to dissuade him with no luck. As Hermes descends, Ares watches him, secretly admiring his determination. The dream hardly shows earthly experiences, but they are known anyway. Hermes fails in his attempts to convince a population tired of religions. He knows for the first time the fear of mortality, which leads him to seek his goals through lies, manipulation, and cruelty. He takes part in wars where he is caught and tortured. He tries to accumulate political and military power to persuade the world, but ends up imprisoned and then exiled on an island. He escapes from captivity and tries his luck in other latitudes. From the skies, Ares watches with concern. In his last years as a mortal, coincidence works a miracle, and the world begins to see Hermes as a god. Already an old man, he spends his last years on top of a palace, being a decadent replica of who he really is. Aware of his victory, all he has to do is wait for time to send him back to the heights. Upon his return, his companions await him. Hermes tells them about his adventures and the details that cannot be seen from above. The dream reminds us of its unpredictable nature and concludes the story with a twist that could be considered comical. After Hermes finishes his story and proclaims himself the bravest of the gods, Ares speaks. He acknowledges that his adventures in the mortal world are praiseworthy, but informs him that someone has taken an even greater risk and also emerged victorious. They remind Hermes of the time Ares tried to talk him out of his plan. His crazy idea was a cause of anguish, but also of inspiration, and Ares, moved by the courage and confidence of Hermes, went one step further. He would lose his status as a god and die in the land of men if Hermes does not return. He gambled everything on the impossible victory of a third party. He relinquished all control over his destiny, and he ended up winning. Thus ends the dream. When Napoleon Bonaparte woke up that morning, so many years ago, he made the decision. He understood from the dream that risk-taking is a trait of the gods and declared his intention to invade Russia. He had managed to create life from nothing. For a moment, the situation made him feel like a god, then like a madman. Diego Berlinés was born in Salamanca in 1997 and lived his entire life in a small village in that region. He worked as a painter. He was not the most talented, but he had a good intuition for art. He sold portraits and landscapes in nearby villages to get by. In bad times, he helped out at a local bakery. Summer had arrived, and Diego was 27 years old. He liked to open the windows so that the smell of rock rolls and thyme filled the house, and he was inspired by the landscape of Sierra de Francia. As a Spaniard, he found that name a bit uncomfortable. He started the painting spontaneously. He used to reflect on the composition and the use of color for days before painting, but this case was an exception, and he let the hand guide him. The joy of those brushstrokes was refreshing. The lack of control of his technique scared him. The chaos was taking shape, and after a few minutes, a landscape and a dusk began to be perceived. Inspiration demanded the presence of human figures, and the hand obeyed. By noon, the painting was finished. It represented an arid landscape, perhaps reminiscent of the Levant. The sky was getting dark, and a couple of stars were beginning to show. To the left, a man looked calmly out of the painting. To the right, a seated woman contemplated the barren hills in the background. Neither the composition nor the colors deserved Diego's praise, but there was something about the painting that satisfied him. Perhaps it was the fact that it had been painted in such an anarchic way, very different from his usual technical rectitude. It was not until the next day that he realized that he had painted more than anyone had ever painted. In the morning, in his study, he felt the presence of someone, but he was alone. The feeling continued, and finally Diego looked closely at the painting. He didn't understand why, but the sensation came from that canvas. He studied the man's figure, specifically his eyes. He remembered the calm gaze that the wild brushstrokes had created, but now those eyes were closed. The size of the man made it difficult to appreciate the details. Perhaps gravity had exerted its effect on some excessive blobs of oil, producing minimal variations. Diego doubted his memory and tried to rationalize the situation, but finding explanations became more difficult with the passing of time, with the smile that appeared on the man's face, with the delicate breath of the wind in his hair, with the grass, which was originally very sparse at the feet of the character, but that was now beginning to spread. The changes were very gradual, imperceptible to the naked eye, and they didn't have the power to change the general image of the work. Once he became used to this phenomenon, Diego accepted the impossible fact. His painting was alive. He searched for a way to communicate with it. He asked the man if he was living, and the next day a smile appeared on the man's face. He asked if he was just lifeless oils, and the painting changed to a serious expression and a frown. The questions went on for days, and all of them received a logical answer. Communication was low but real. Diego decided to show his work to several friends and family members. He still didn't fully trust his sanity. He didn't tell them about the magic of the painting, and none of them noticed anything out of the ordinary. The only comments were those related to the quality of the work. Diego's new technique was not well accepted, that only he felt the human presence of the painting worried him, and he thought that it would be best to keep it a secret. The conversation continued at bureaucratic speed, but the friendship arose inevitably, and to celebrate it, Diego decided to introduce a small change in the painting. His artistic intuition asked for a small contrast of color. He painted an impossible red shooting star. He thought that part of the beauty of shooting stars was their brevity, and he frequently repainted it, shortening its tail and extending its front to mimic movement. Finally, the star disappeared from the sky, and the effect was complete. The man's smile the next day seemed to convey gratitude for the gift. Diego learned that the man could see everything that was happening in the room. He wondered if the woman in the painting could see the landscape, since her back was turned and he hadn't painted her a face. If so, would she only see the painted landscape, or could she imagine a new world that extended beyond the borders of the canvas, a world reserved only for her? Diego asked the relevant questions. After months of dialogue, he knew that the woman could create a landscape that extended to the limits of her vision, but she had not done so yet. The information needed for the creative process entered through the eyes of the man, and he had only seen one room. Diego took the painting all over his village. He showed it Sierra de Francia. He even took it to Salamanca and Madrid. With the information that was coming to her, the woman created a new world, unreachable for Diego, and filled it with people, who in turn created new landscapes with new people, and these in turn created new landscapes, unreachable places for the woman. Diego thought about this infinite process, how he would have liked to get into the painting and see those horizons appear successively behind the arid hills that he had painted. How he would have liked to contemplate the cities and talk with the people of that second universe that was inevitably extending. He wondered if he might not already be there, in the form of a painting imagined by another painting. Months passed. One night, Diego took the painting out to an old road on the outskirts of the village so it could see the stars. How many new worlds would have been created? How many new people? Soon, the numbers became too big and they failed him. Would that place be a continuous plain, sprinkled with mountains, or would it end up forming a spherical planet? Would galaxies form? How far could this world within another world extend? Diego found the answer to this last question when he looked up, and in the brilliant sky of Salamanca, he saw an impossible red shooting star. We are in a London bar, and a veteran thief tells his friends one of his adventures on the other side of the world. The group listens attentively. The presence of the speaker and his unruly voice demand their respect. The person recounting the events was named Henry B. Lawrence. I do not know his age at the time he narrates this story, but I know that in his youth he participated in the First World War, where he didn't learn anything. Later, he enlisted as a crew member on a ship captained by a man of unsettling reputation. Thus, he traveled the world and its countries, staining each of them with his misdeeds. Now, he is talking about his trip to India. He arrived in Madras in 1923 without really knowing why. It was the captain who wanted to meet with the governor of the city, surely with the intention of developing some clandestine project. Henry was not interested in politics and was given several days off. He explored the surroundings of the port and found some buildings of Indo-Saracen architecture typical of the British Raj. Their distinctive shapes amazed him. The River Cone, however, he considered inferior to the Thames. In a market, he met an English lawyer based in the city. The coincidence that both were natives of Liverpool facilitated their conversations. They walked together, and the lawyer, well versed in Hindu history, offered a lot of information about the country. Information that Henry deemed perfectly useless. Just before saying goodbye, the lawyer spoke about the temples in the area and the rumors that they were hiding a treasure. Henry asked for more details, and the lawyer directed him to a village on the outskirts. As a good thief, he had decided to steal that treasure, in the same way that he had stolen the watch from his unsuspecting compatriot. Henry's friends at the bar celebrated the theft. He continued the story, describing his arrival in the village. He found the temple behind some tall trees, removed from the fragile houses. He wandered around aimlessly until he saw a human figure in the distance. He deduced that he was a monk from the unique robes that wrapped him and followed the man. The monk entered one of the 4 pyramidal towers that made up the temple. Henry stood in front of the gate and contemplated the tower and the shrine erected within it. In the London bar, Henry fell silent for a moment at this point in the story. The playful expression and the smile with which he had recounted his adventure left his fleshy face. He looked down and gulped nervously. His friends took this silence to be a stylistic device of the speaker, but a more discerning observer would have seen the doubt on his lips and the shyness in his eyes. Henry composed his expression and continued with the story. He spoke of a tantalizing door inside the tower and how his intuition told him that the treasure was behind it. Henry walked violently through the sanctuary. The monk spotted him and stepped between him and the door. A shove opened the way for him and sent the slight monk to the ground. As he was about to reach his target, a neighbor pounced on him. He shook him off as best he could. The man lacked the monk's inhibitions and seemed ready to fight. Henry explained the fight and all its pugilistic details to the delight of his group of friends. He was victorious. Through his exposure, it was clear that he was an expert fighter and that his rival was brave and tough. Everyone was impatiently waiting for the conclusion of the story, and he revealed it in the following way. "Do you know what I found behind the door? Nothing." And he accompanied those words with a laugh and a slap on the table. His friends laughed with him. The experienced thief's intuition had failed him, and his efforts had been in vain. However, that was not what happened that day in that temple. Let me tell you the truth that Henry won't or can't tell. I will resume the narrative at the point where Henry stops in front of the temple tower. Until then, the facts described are true. Henry looks up at the tall stone structure. He is overwhelmed by all those colors and the countless forms of the detailed statues in which Henry identified gods, people, and animals. An imposing god dressed with jewels has multiplied his arms. He holds a spear with which he kills a man at his feet, and fangs stick out from his mouth. He rests on a light blue halo of inconceivable details. Some appear to be flames, others snake skin. Behind the god, he sees numerous smaller human sculptures contorting. Some of them are blue-skinned. He also distinguishes an elephant. Above them rises a goddess, blue, with 12 heads and arms. These visions paralyze and silence Henry, who only reacts when the monk speaks to him and with a gesture invites him to enter the sanctuary. Once inside, sacred statues await him and hypnotize him. He sees Parvati, wife of Shiva, whom he begins to worship despite knowing nothing about her. Henry feels what we all know to be true, what no one can put into words. But a beautiful, spiritual experience is something that the reputation of a tough street criminal cannot bear. In the London tavern, the laughter caused by the end of the story began to fade. A stranger who had heard the narration recognized the accent and decided to mock the thief. Those from Liverpool are not even good at stealing. Nothingness is a good booty for you. Henry didn't see the humor in those words, or maybe he did and got up to face the man. He defended the lie he had told, but let out fragments of the truth. He said, "You are mistaken if you think I came back empty-handed. I returned from my trip with an adventure, with a fight between two men, with the beauty of a temple and a new faith that has not abandoned me. I advise you not to underestimate nothingness, because it is the only thing that separates the knife in my hand from your heart." Sometimes my guests wonder why some of the pictures hanging in my house are covered. I guess this story will answer the question. I arrived in the village at the beginning of September. Given the events that took place there, I think it is necessary to omit its name. I will say that around 600 people lived there at the time, and that it is located somewhere in the middle of Spain. Until then, I had lived in Madrid. The reason for moving was none other than to help my uncle in his bar. I was 24 years old. Acclimatizing to the rural environment was easier than expected. I had always had a restless mind, and it never allowed me to be bored. I could consider myself lucky. My uncle owned the only color television in the whole village. However, there was no phone at home, and so I had promised my parents that I would send them letters frequently. I would have kept my promise if I hadn't had to leave so soon. The Sunday Mass seemed to multiply the population, who gathered fervently in front of the church. In those crowds, I met some young people. I had already seen a couple of them at the bar. The group of friends consisted of 4 guys and 1 girl. I saw something special in her. They introduced themselves and let me know that the girl's name was Elisa. I was also told that she didn't introduce herself because she was mute. It didn't take long for me to be part of the group. We used to meet in the afternoons at the bar. I often looked at Elisa. The magnetism of her presence contrasted with her shyness. She had short, straight hair, and the shape of her eyes hinted at an Eastern origin. Her smile would be beautiful if she didn't have the unfortunate habit of covering it with her hands. The boys told me that she had also arrived in the village a few months ago, and that she was unaware of many customs. A few times I walked together with Elisa. She wouldn't let a plant pass without caressing it, and had a special touch with animals. I envied that the skittish cats approached her, and once I even saw a sparrow perch on her forehead while she was looking at the clouds. The advantages of looking like an angel, I thought. Unfortunately, a city guy like me couldn't offer her much information about nature. Her eyes and her unfamiliarity with the customs made me ask her about her foreign origin. Her reaction seemed to confirm it. The only reason I didn't ask for more details was that I didn't want to expose my embarrassing ignorance of geography. It was in the middle of October when a local painting contest was organized. Elisa was interested in it, and together we encouraged her to participate. We were unaware of this artistic side of her, but it didn't surprise us. The exhibition was held in a small shop owned by a neighbor. Too many people gathered there, and the suffocating atmosphere made me and my friends leave. Only Elisa remained inside. The paintings were covered by a cloth, waiting for the inauguration. When the works were revealed, a murmur began, which soon became an uproar. Elisa had painted an abstract piece, and its inexplicable shapes drove people crazy. Those present moved away from her while they pointed at and insulted her. The village priest denounced her as a monster and demanded violence. The neighbors allowed themselves to be carried away by his guttural, religious voice. Elisa ran past us. We still didn't understand the confusion. However, We acted quickly when we noticed the aggressiveness of the people and blocked the door with our bodies. The neighbors yelled at us that the girl was a monster and that she had to be killed. I understood that there were enough of my friends to block the way, and I ran to help Elisa. I arrived at her house, shaken and breathless. I searched for her without success. I looked out the window, and in the distance I saw the murderous moth appear. My friends were there. They had seen the painting and were consumed by fury. I went down to the basement, the only place I hadn't checked. I turned on the light, but it barely illuminated the room. I found Elisa crouching in the darkness of a corner, and I approached her slowly. I was not alarmed when her innumerable eyes stared at me in fear, nor when the tentacles timidly tried to hide what seemed to be a face. I called Elisa by her name and extended a helping hand. He opened a notebook and began to write with a newly purchased fountain pen. 3 words later, he dropped it in panic. His hand had written by itself, with a will of its own. He slowly moved away from the desk. First, he was in cold sweats, and then in tears. He fell to his knees and covered his face in despair. The man suffering on the ground is called Carlos Riquelme. Before telling his story, it would be appropriate to know some details about him. He is 42 years old and lives in Salamanca, in a little old house protected by tall apartment buildings, an architectural anachronism that pleases the eyes of many. He is a writer of little success, and he is passionate about fountain pens. He collects them and even makes them by hand. His self-made pens have an unexpected quality, and many feel that he should be selling them instead of trying to live off his unfortunate literature. The last pen he produced was a birthday present for Eduardo Pimentel, an older and more successful writer. Although they spoke often, the relationship between them was strange. Carlos admired him in public and envied him in secret. He had wanted to confess that feeling to him for a long time, but a few days after receiving the gift, Eduardo Pimentel took his own life. Carlos was still on his knees on the floor. He felt an irresistible impulse that sat him back in the chair and compelled him to write. His hand seemed to have a life of its own again. He stopped only to look at the pen with hatred. He had bought it second-hand at a nearby antique shop that he used to visit frequently. The owner, knowing the tastes of his regular customer, had recommended it to him. It was worn and the design was coarse, violent, very different from the usual elegance of the pens he made. But it was precisely those imperfections that had captivated him. The ostentatious clip that crowned it also had had an influence on him. He struggled to stop writing. With difficulty, he closed the notebook. He left the house with it under his arm and with the pen in the inside pocket of his jacket. He hurried to the antique shop in search of information. He asked about the origin of the pen. The owner admitted that he had received it from a curly-haired young man, on the condition that he only sells it to Carlos Riquelme. But before doing that, an old man had offered him a high sum for the pen, and he hadn't rejected it. The old man had passed away after a few weeks, and his daughter had returned the pen to the antique shop. Carlos asked some questions and obtained the address of the family who lived on the parallel street and the telephone number of the curly-haired young man. He wasted no time and left the store. He was running, but had to stop to write. He felt the irresistible urge of an addiction. 3 or 4 lines later, he barely managed to get up and continue his journey. He was received by the old man's daughter, who was careless enough to let such a catastrophic man get in. Carlos asked about the pen. The woman explained that she had returned it because of the bad memories it brought. Her late father had bought it, and from the first day, an insane passion had consumed him. The woman stopped talking for a moment. She knew that what she was going to tell him was hard to believe. She said that after several days of continuous writing, her father had committed suicide, and that the story he had been writing explained in detail his last days. This didn't surprise Carlos. Rather, it confirmed what he was already feeling. Then he called the young man with curls from a phone booth and found out that he also lived in Salamanca. He took a bus, and while he was traveling, the pen dominated him again and forced him to continue the story. In the tale he was writing, the protagonist had already bought a cursed object and was looking for information about it. Right now, Carlos is in front of the door. The young man takes his time to open. They finally see each other. Carlos finds the young man familiar. The young man recognizes Carlos. He also perceives the writer's distress, and after pausing for a second, he decides on an arrogant smile. The nervous man introduces himself. "My name is Carlos Riquelme." The young man replies, "I am Mario Pimentel." The surname throws Carlos to the ground. After regaining his composure, he takes the pen out of his pocket and shows it. He asks the young man what he knows about it. Mario answers, "Perhaps you know more. After all, it is you who created it and who gave it to my father. Even while being corrupted by the cursed effect of the pen, my father guessed your intentions and calculated a revenge. I took it for a delusional product of his old age, and although I pretended to believe him so as not to disappoint him, the facts ended up correcting me. At some point, you confessed to my father your tastes regarding pens. With that information, we modified the murderous pen you sent us to make it unrecognizable and attractive. I reasoned that giving it to you directly might arouse suspicion. As you can see, I'm not a good actor, nor did I want to involve third parties, with one exception. I gave the pen to the owner of the antique shop you frequent, on the condition that he never uses it and that he recommends and sells it to you. Then I waited until today." Carlos Riquelme finished his story 3 days later. The pen decreed an end in fire, and the flames consumed the house, the body, and the cursed object. Today, I received a letter from a friend. I met him for the first time more than a decade ago on a trip that ended in a disgraceful way. And although after that humiliating adventure we haven't seen each other again, there is an irrefutable and confidential bond between us. The letter doesn't contain any remarkable information, but having it in my hand seems to encourage me to recount what happened all those years ago. The trip began in Cáceres, where I was enjoying a few days off. I drove north with the intention of visiting some villages, and with the help of a faulty map, I ended up lost in the mountains. A small village emerged behind a bend in the road, and so I stopped to eat and to locate myself. The food was invigorating, but the experience turned rather chaotic when an agitated customer started to hurl threats. The insults were directed at a man called Israel, who didn't appear to be present in the restaurant. The enraged man left soon, and the situation led to a conversation with another customer. Knowing that I wasn't from the town, he bought me a beer at the bar next door as an apology for the incident. Even though I knew it wasn't his fault, I accepted the courtesy. He was a broad and slow man. He walked with strength and confidence, but I felt a certain weakness in him. His outgoing demeanor and his honesty left a good impression on me. He gave me his name, Roman. He is the author of the letter I'm holding right now. We said goodbye after the beer, and I ventured to investigate the village. It didn't take me long to hear the name Israel again, always accompanied by insults. The first time, I thought I had run into the maniac from the restaurant again, but it turned out that insulting Israel was a common practice among neighbors. I was surprised that such a calm-looking village would openly show that kind of animosity. I couldn't help myself and asked the neighbors. They let me know that Israel was a young painter from the village, that he was an orphan, and that they were upset with him because the paintings they commissioned from him were not of the expected quality. To justify their anger, some neighbors showed me the pictures that Israel had painted for them. They kept them hidden in the depths of their houses, as if it were a disgrace to display them. One even had a piece torn off, and another was covered in mold. Upon seeing the works, I mumbled some faint-hearted response out of courtesy. I wanted to agree with them, but those portraits looked sensational to me. I'm not going to pretend to possess a great knowledge of art, but I felt fully justified in thinking that the locals had exorbitant standards. And even if it wasn't the case, it didn't seem reasonable to me to insult or threaten, nor did it seem reasonable to me that they continued to commission paintings from him, given the reputation he had. I decided to visit Israel. The doors in the villages are usually open during the day, something that is terrifying for us urban people. But the door of Israel's house was closed, and the windows on the first floor were boarded up. The young man only let me pass when he saw that I was a stranger. He was quiet and polite. Incomprehensible curls covered his forehead. He was grateful to talk to someone who didn't hate him. I thought it prudent not to bring up the subject of the paintings directly and steered the conversation towards more mundane matters. We liked each other, and the trust that was formed between us meant that some questions could not be postponed any longer. He replied that he knew why people insulted and threatened him, and why, despite this, he continued to receive orders. However, he refused to give more information. He had no problems with showing me the portraits he was working on, and I honestly let him know that I thought they were wonderful. He began to retouch one of them and spoke. Perhaps they are, but I don't paint them with passion. They are nothing more than a degrading job. He painted without energy or authority. His posture corroborated the words. I advised him to move to a big city. Israel explained to me that he was aware that his talent could bring him a lot of money and fame, but he preferred his hometown. It was getting dark and we said goodbye. I promised to come back one day. A handful of neighbors saw me leaving Israel's house and quickly surrounded me. They overwhelmed me with questions about the painter. They wanted to know what he was doing, what he was painting, when he would leave the house. The behavior of the people began to seem pathological to me. From their hasty comments, I knew that something had happened 3 years ago. I didn't want to take part in that madness, and so I left them behind. At the entrance of the village, I met Roman. He warned me that it was dangerous to drive at night on those roads, and he invited me to spend the night at his house. The unusual behavior of the neighbors had piqued my curiosity, and I accepted the offer. I had dinner with Roman and his family, and went to bed early. The sound of breaking glass and a scream woke me during the night. Someone was calling for the thief to be caught. I ran to the window, and from there I could see 2 men fighting. Soon more neighbors appeared and threw punches at the thief. One of them snatched the loot from the criminal, and then the punches and kicks were directed at him. The object changed hands a couple of times, and the holder always received the fury of the group. I couldn't tell what that precious loot was. From a distance, it seemed like a simple piece of paper. Finally, the crowd dispersed, and only a couple of bloodied neighbors remained on the street. One of them was Roman. I took him home and tended to his wounds. They were not serious, just a small cut on his forehead and a black eye, the kind of injuries a man like him consents to with serenity. His pride hurt more. I saw his ashamed face behind the hands that hid it. He made sure his wife and his daughter slept, and he apologized to me. It was humiliating for him to have lost control and to have participated in that spontaneous fight. He confessed that these types of incidents happened regularly, and that it was not his first time. He asked me to stay with him for a few more days, to help him and to help a village that was losing its sanity. In exchange, he told me the details of that paranoia. It all began when Israel showed his first painting to the neighbors 3 years beforehand. He placed it in front of his door, hoping that a naive neighbor would buy it. People gathered around the canvas and looked at it as if in a trance, their eyes only accepting the superior beauty of that work. The rumor spread, and by the end of the day, the whole town had seen the painting. Roman saw it in the evening. Israel was concerned to see the reaction of the people, which confirmed a fear that he had taken for superstition. Some tried to prevent him from taking the painting inside, almost at midnight. The day dawned with a crowd at the gate of Israel. The young man came out and announced that he had destroyed the painting. People went crazy. They needed to admire it, to feed on the talented strokes of the genius. They were addicts. Israel, wanting to calm the crowd, promised that he would accept commissions thereafter. Orders piled up, but the customers were never satisfied. The new paintings, despite their quality, didn't have the hypnotic magic of the first. I remembered the apathy with which he created them. The people demanded Israel's true talent, and when the author refused, they attacked him and threatened him, blinded by anger. Sometimes, in these despised works, a neighbor finds an outstanding brushstroke, a mote of the highest talent that has escaped the painter. And so he rips out that fragment and treasures it. Contemplating it helps him to recover his sanity. One of those fragments was what the thief had stolen, the precious loot that led to violence. I visited Israel the following day. I told him that I knew the truth. He confirmed it. My idea was to convince the young man to show some of his real paintings again, the ones he paints with passion. But through his silence and his sad expression, I knew that it was a possibility that he had already pondered and discarded. He told me, "I haven't left the town because that would end up driving people crazy. Showing my paintings would even be more dangerous. The gift that I possess is destructive and lethal. It is something that I confirmed when I first showed my painting, and something that I had suspected since my childhood." His words made me remember that he was an orphan. Our conversation was interrupted by a stone breaking the window and the screams that followed it. A threatening man was waiting in the street, and Israel came out to confront him. He told me not to worry, that he was used to it. I followed him and watched from the door. After exchanging a few sentences, the man punched Israel's jaw. He collapsed and his head crashed violently against the cobblestones. The criminal, who was as cowardly as he was aggressive, fled. Israel remained motionless as the red puddle spread out under his head. Roman showed up with his car at the right moment and was able to take him to the nearest hospital. I went back to the house to get my jacket, and on my way out, I ran into a small group. Seeing Israel's door open had been an insurmountable temptation for them. I blocked the way, but feeling their insistence and aggressiveness, I locked myself inside the house. I didn't intend to stay long, but I didn't want to let anyone in. I had locked the door from the inside with the bolt, but needed a key to lock it from the outside. The search took me through the rooms. I entered one that Israel had never shown me. It had a very high ceiling and no windows. I turned on the light and a majestic, omnipotent, infinite painting appeared before me. I looked at it and got lost. Its enormous dimension pulled me in. I spent 7 days in front of it, happily trapped. On the 7th day, I recovered a minimum of reason and fled the town secretly. Israel spent 10 days in the hospital. He returned home and the problems continued. Finally, the police intervened. It seems that some of them also suffered or enjoyed the influence of the painting. It was decided to demolish the house, and Israel abandoned the village. It saddens me to think of those centenary stones falling on the art and slaughtering it. What an ugly end to that perfect, severed canvas. I know these details thanks to the letters that Roman sends me. He is always grateful for the help that I uselessly offered. Also because his mental health is stable, thanks to a gift that I sent him in a letter. As for my sanity, what manages to preserve it is what my eyes see right now. The lower right-hand corner of that magical canvas, which I tore off on an impulse when I came to my senses in the house of Israel. The piece of canvas that led to my embarrassing escape. Well known is our ability to perceive faces in all kinds of objects. The slight cracks in a wall can produce a characteristic profile. A pair of windows and a door can transform a facade into an expression of wonder. This visual trickery is one of the variants of a phenomenon called pareidolia. For us, this effect is nothing more than a funny moment, perhaps in some cases a recurring symbol. But for Arturo Sandoval, pareidolia was a talent, a link with an unthinkable place. Arturo's childhood was normal for that time and for that village in the mountains. He obediently went to school, the only one in the village, and when he came back home, he helped his father and brothers to work the land in a small patch owned by the family. Since he was a child, he had seen countless faces, and each one of them had fascinated him. At school, he made many of his classmates laugh when he pointed out hidden expressions. But he soon realized that the others didn't share his enthusiasm, and he ended up being mocked for it. As with any art, his skill was refined with use and time. Although he had learned not to talk about faces, he understood that many of those he saw were imperceptible to others. He knew that he had a unique talent, perhaps to protect that gift, or perhaps because he felt different. He avoided contact with people. He lost himself in that world of faces. Years later, during his adolescence, his talent reached an incomprehensible stage. At some point, the faces began to convey more complex, real expressions. Arturo noticed in them changing emotions that, with time, became more identifiable. Guided by his instinct, he began to study those feelings, and he recognized a grammar in them. The sensations that the faces spread took the form of words, and Arturo was granted access to a confusing language. It took him 4 or 5 years to master the language of the faces. He didn't miss the human contact. His new company was more interesting to him. The walls of the town were perplexed to see a human speaking to them in their own language. The objects, perhaps because of their passive nature, were less aggressive and more polite. The company that Arturo Sandoval appreciated most was that of the faces that he found in nature, those that he discovered in the oak trees, in the moss on a rock, in the soil of the vineyards. In his 30s, he diagnosed an excess of people in the village and chose to seclude himself in the southern forests in the Batuecas Valley. He walked dense paths and spoke with the faces on them, also with those on the trees and rocks, and even with those in the streams, in whose waters occasional patterns are formed and therefore possible friends. The beings of the forest were delighted to converse with a human and helped him to provide himself with food. After a few days of wandering, he found the right place. The faces in the 2 pines spoke politely. The 1,000-year-old oak was playful and extroverted. The stream, shy but curious. Fragments of the sun dodged through the leaves and fell on the moss and plants. The lucky faces that received the light sang to celebrate. That corner of the forest was governed by a large rock, which helped direct the stream in the right direction. Arturo thought it was majestic. It was very smooth, and no face embellished it. Otherwise, Arturo wouldn't have sat on it. He would have considered it rude. It was in this inaccessible place where the man saw the time pass by. One morning, he suddenly missed the village and human contact. He didn't know how many years had passed, but it was more than 10. He decided to go back. His friends understood his decision and even encouraged it. The face of the oak, formed by a wound in the bark and moss, begged him to come back for a visit, and Arturo promised to do so as he climbed down from the rock. The silhouette of the village in the distance looked a bit different to him. It had spread over a hill in a somewhat careless way. These changes were opposed by the landscape, which was still intact, displaying vineyards and orchards with diligent apple trees. The first thing he saw upon arrival was a modest, newly built bar. He walked in and seconds later ran out. The gazes had scared him. He entered the village, and a couple of neighbors terrified him again with their presence. Their faces were not human, they were monsters. However, their attitude was peaceful. They were only surprised at Arturo's reaction, as if his fear was inexplicable. Some faces had extra eyes. They contorted into an indecipherable grimace. Where there should have been a nose, there was an ear. The deep and unnatural wrinkles produced a cruel and perpetual smile. He saw fangs and horns. Those monstrosities not only frightened him, they also seemed to express the darkness of each individual. He spoke to some of the walls and cobblestones, who were glad to see him again, but couldn't offer help. Arturo ran to his house and spotted his father and his oldest brother in the front yard. They wore beastly faces. He recognized them by the familiarity of their bodies and clothes. He didn't have the courage to speak to them. he walked out of the village once more. Back in nature, with no people around him, but still with his hometown in sight, he formulated a theory that explained the situation. The faces he saw on objects had become the norm for him. He had forgotten the slight proportions and details that make up a human face and distinguish it from monsters. Now he applied the rules of objects to humans, and the result was those disturbing chimeras. Arturo gave up the world of humans and returned to his corner in the Batuecas Valley with his friends. The faces welcomed him, but they were surprised. They didn't expect such an early return. Arturo sat on top of his rock and explained what had happened. He had made the decision to spend the many days that remained to him there. The faces knew that a man's life is much shorter, and they tried to make him happy. Together they played and sang. One night, after many years, Arturo lay down on his favorite rock for the last time. His friends had sensed the fatal outcome days before, but hid his fate from him. Years and centuries passed in that intimate place in the forest. Arturo's rock was hit by the insistent force of the stream, which patiently sculpted. Perennial moss appeared on it, and implacable time drew cracks on its surface. It is no longer smooth. Now different patterns cover it. And even if we don't have a special talent, any of us can distinguish the face of Arturo Sandoval in that rock. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider giving a like and subscribing to the channel. Have a good day.